We seem to have this fascination with failure in our culture. People enjoy watching others fail any sort of task, often finding it amusing and enjoying their misery. Heck, my initial content was based off of me failing challenges and people seem to enjoy it. It's the same reason why failed products are often more memorable than successful ones. There's a reason horrible films like the Emoji Movie have been discussed more than successful films like James Cameron's Avatar. There's this odd curiosity in disasters that pique our interest and make us pose the question, how did this manage to happen? Before the age of the internet brought game developers the ability to update and patch their games, if a video game was released and flopped due to its own issues, then it remained a failure and just an asset to write off for the company's taxes. However, with developers being able to constantly and easily patch their games, this has led to quite a few different, let's call it business practices. A game launching with issues is more common than it should be nowadays, but because of the ability to patch games, a disaster now has a chance of being salvaged. While its reputation may be permanently tarnished, the devs still have a chance to build that reputation back up with updates. This is an unfortunate fact of the industry's current mindset of releasing games regardless of if they're finished and polished because they know people will still buy them. Even being released under the guise of early access can ruin a game's chances. But this is an entirely different topic for a video, so instead let me try and get to the main question. Let's say you're in the boat of people who bought a game, only to end up being disappointed with the experience the launch version handed to you. You stopped playing it, but down the line your curiosity is piqued by the game and you ask yourself, should I give it a second chance? This question is what I want to talk about today. When, or if, you should give a game a second chance. I'll be looking at 5 main examples of games that were fraught with different issues on launch, that ultimately tarnished their reputations and impacted their player base, a usually mandatory statistic to determine if a company continues to support a game. However, before those, I need to talk about one reason to not give a game a second chance that I do need to address. If there's a game you initially had little to no interest in, then there's likely no reason to give the game a second chance unless your gaming preferences have drastically changed since you tried it. Since this is a very personalized reason, I'll use my own experiences and preferences as an example. I'll put this as simply as I can so that I can move on to the examples that aren't as opinionated as this one. I don't like tactical shooters at all. It's not the type of shooter that tickles me in the right places, so no, I am not a fan of CSGO or Rainbow Six. Because of this preference, when I attempted to play Valorant, I knew it was not the game for me in the slightest. Therefore, even if it continues receiving new content as its lifespan continues on, I have no reason to give it a second chance due to the fact that it was an issue I had with the core gameplay. If you are in a situation akin to that, then there's probably no real reason for you to give it a second chance. It may be one of the greatest games made of this generation, but if you don't care for the experience and type of style it brings, then no one's forcing you to keep trying to enjoy it. But Valorant actually segues nicely into the first example since it was released with very little content to begin with. Especially with games being able to be easily updated as they are nowadays, many games are released to the public with very little substantial content. Sometimes this is labeled as early access, sometimes it's not. Regardless of the categorization, lackluster content upon release is something that can really kill the game's ability to retain a player base. This is especially problematic for games that focus on multiplayer online experiences, as players often don't enjoy repetitive gameplay, or say, a lack of progression. Yeah, okay, that Sea Shanty background music gives away the game, so bring her in! Sea of Thieves is a very good example of this. The game was advertised as an open-world, multiplayer-only pirate game where you could plunder islands and other ships, both AI and player-controlled, and just generally be a thieving scallywag. This seemed like a fantastically fun idea that many people were excited to play, but the release experience was about as much fun as choking on that whole banana you're shoving into your scurvy-ridden pirate mouth. For a game that boasted a large open sea with tons of multiplayer fun to be had, the game that launched was pretty barren of content. To top things off, actually trying to play and talk to your crew was a massive, massive hassle, which caused many early players of the game issues in experiencing how it was meant to be experienced. The game was limited to the same handful of bounty quests that became very repetitive very quickly, and with the limited loot and enemies to fight, it just wasn't worth sticking around after a few sessions. However, looking at the game a year later, it's easy to see just how much content was added. Rare really stuck to it and kept supporting the game, despite its initial failure to capture an audience. Now, Sea of Thieves has gotten the attention it deserves thanks to the developer's commitment and its accessibility through the Xbox Game Pass. The game has received a massive amount of content updates that help not only flesh out the game, but provide additional rewards and incentives to pirating, story-guided mission tales known as Tall Tales, and even a battle royale mode on the open seas for those who are simply bloodthirsty and not necessarily in it for the gold. If a game ends up being like the Sea of Thieves development, then it is absolutely worth a second chance. Just because a game lacked content on release doesn't mean it continues to have the same issue, so long as the devs or community support the game. However, if this lackluster content is tied to broken developer promises, then it becomes complicated on whether or not the game should be given a fair second chance. When I say false promises, recent viewers of this channel will know I'm talking about Battle for Bikini Bottom Rehydrated's violated promises to bring back— No, I have talked about that game twice already and I've gotten my grievances out about it. Let's instead talk about the game that became infamous for a mountain of false promises upon its initial release, No Man's Sky. Oh boy, No Man's Sky is probably the most infamous example of player expectations being crushed by the playable product, and one of the best examples why expectations should not have a ticket on the hype train. Many core features that the devs had promised were not available on launch, or were implemented features that proved to be lackluster in execution. Here's a list of both types of issues because there's way too many for me to talk about, and truth be told, I'm not extremely familiar with the game, so I don't feel comfortable talking in depth about it. To top this all off, the developers, Hello Games, ended up going silent after the launch, despite the fact they had several players creating an uproar of disappointment. Additionally, there were promotional materials and official game page descriptions that stated features that didn't exist in the game upon launch. The development and release of No Man's Sky was ripe with issues that may morally impact a person's decision to ever play the game. This game became a prime example of how not to market a game, as the marketing outright lied about the quality and state of the game. These sorts of reasons, I would say, would be more than enough to prevent giving the game a second chance. False advertising mixed with promises that weren't executed correctly and topped off with developers remaining silent quite a while after launch should not be supported. Now, if you're interested in knowing where No Man's Sky ended up years down the line, the game has received significant updates that has added the promised multiplayer mode 2 years after launch, more distinct fleshed out environments, and basically just the content that makes the game more like the version that was marketed before launch. No Man's Sky failure was due to its own ambition and broken promises, but sometimes it's not always the result of the game itself, but rather outside factors. Not every game that ends up being a financial failure or fails to hold the player base is bad. There are more factors in a game's success aside from the quality of the game. Yeah, it's time I talk about the other TF2 that's actually weirdly popular among TF2 players. Titanfall 2 is one of the saddest examples of out-of-touch publishers and marketing departments. If it even had one! Since this isn't a video about why TF2 failed, I'll summarize a variety of reasons as to why it was a victim of circumstances. Unlike the other games that are mentioned in this video, Titanfall 2 didn't start off underwhelming or a mess. It was instead the opposite, a solid and complete game that did what a sequel should do and improve on the first game. A large point of criticism reviewers and players had with the first one was a lack of a single-player campaign. While the multiplayer of the first game was definitely the selling point, the lack of a single-player option alienated several players who either wanted a more laid-back, less stressful option to experience the game, or didn't want to hop into a PvP game right off the bat. Titanfall 2 came with a single-player campaign that, while relatively short, ended up being regarded as one of the best FPS campaigns ever created, as it helped to flesh out the world of Titanfall, created great characters, and an actual connection between the character you play as and the Titan you're thrusted into. For the core draw of the game, the multiplayer was also expanded upon, giving it more depth and refining its mechanics. By all accounts, Titanfall 2 did exactly what a sequel should, but it unfortunately didn't succeed in the numbers games that all games and products have to unfortunately play in. Respawn/EA decided to push the game out between the releases of a mainline Battlefield and Call of Duty game, which were series that already had more popularity for being a military-style shooter, and in which COD had mech suits as a mechanic. Coupled with almost no marketing, the game performed underwhelmingly poorly. If a game falls under this category by being a solid game on release but was a victim of outside circumstances, then it is definitely a game you should give a second chance, especially if new life was breathed into it such as Titanfall 2 and Sea of Thieves. However, if it was a game that touted an abusive monetization model, and that was a big issue with you, well, let's just move on to the next one. Oh boy, greedy monetization practices are common and prevalent throughout today's games. Ever since companies realized that they could add in microtransactions to further siphon their players' wallets or make the game under the games as a service model, horrible monetization practices have popped up from even the most high-profile AAA games. Monetization models are something that is widely hated by the consumer base, but whether it affects you enough to drop a game or never try it as a personal moral opinion and choice. The most egregious monetization model a game can adopt is the pay-to-win model, in which players who shell out real-world money gain access to items, weapons, and/or characters that directly affect and alter their gameplay experience, and means of progression, as opposed to simple cosmetic changes. This model becomes especially problematic when these items are both borderline direct upgrades to what non-paying players are given, and it takes place in an online multiplayer game. Say hello to Star Wars Battlefront 2, the game with the most infamous loot box system that was one of two major loot box systems that caused the Belgian government to label them as gambling and therefore illegal. There's our explanation. Needless to say, I think almost everyone can agree that Battlefront 2's reputation was massacred by its horrendous loot box system. A year after the controversy, they finally fully fixed the loot box system by completely eliminating loot boxes in the game and making everything unlockable via progression. But it was already too late to salvage some sort of positive reputation. When you're thinking about giving a game a second chance that initially had a poor monetization model that turned you away from it, this isn't one that I can give a definite answer to, as it's a very opinionated choice. Some people have strong beliefs that they should not support a game that has or had greedy choices implemented, but others might not care as much. For me personally, if a game launches with an abusive monetization model and does nothing to try and fix it, most common in mobile games, then I don't feel it's worth trying again. But if it's a game I was initially interested in, but was turned away due to their money practices, then maybe I'll give it another shot so long as the company has attempted to alter those practices. For our final category, we have the absolute disaster games. These are games that just had so many different things wrong with them, and maybe even before launch, that made it hard to categorize one main reason why the game caused players to fall off of it. One of the best examples of this is Anthem. Oh yeah, I'm sure a lot of you know just how much of a mess this game was. Since this isn't a video analyzing all the issues that Anthem brought up, I'll put on screen a rather simplified list of what went wrong for time's sake and what players had issues with. Chances are, games that had multiple massive misses such as Anthem probably didn't even recover enough to continue having developer support. Or, in Anthem's case, receive enough developer support quick enough to save its reputation. Anthem seems to still be receiving updates, but at the pace of TF2 back in 2016 with promises from devs that have no real estimated time. Yeah. If any of the games you're considering trying out again were an absolute mess upon release, then there's a good chance you may not even have the option to play it again, especially if these were exclusively online games. Games that function as such have a limited lifespan that's decided by the dev's willingness to spend time and resources supporting the game, as well as how well the game does in the almighty number game. Even though this video started off with the question of when should you give a game a second chance, I can't really give a concrete answer. This is both a personal, subjective answer to each person, but it's also dependent on the game that's being considered. The best I can answer this question was by giving you guys an idea of why people may have rejected a game they were initially interested in, and whether or not it would have been a good reason to return to it. Regardless of the faults each of the games discussed here were subjected to, all 4 of these games have indeed improved since their initial release. Even No Man's Sky, who was subject to a lot of criticism for their false marketing, has significantly improved as a game and experience, fixing many issues players had with the launch version. Choosing to give a game a second chance is a personal decision, but one thing that's always important is research. In fact, research like you're making a 15-minute video about games that had trouble launches. Special thanks to my Delirious Death Merchants, Damp Volcano, and GTY200, because you certainly have to be delirious to be my highest supporters. Also thanks to As Is Light.